are in the community are trying to figure out like, okay, what should I do next? And I have this big goal, for example, getting my whole team to be aligned. How do I get there, and etc. I think some of those could be part of the small steps towards achieving those goals.
Certainly. But I mean, if you want to talk about alignment, right? So you want to get your team aligned, and we're kind of switching subjects here, but I know this is important, so I want to touch on this. So if you want to get people aligned with you, make sure that you're first aligned on your values, right? You want to have a long-term alignment. Make sure that you are viewing things the same way, because ultimately, if you're not aligned on your values, different things are going to be important, right? So I never stop saying this. So life is all about priorities. What's a priority to you, and what drives your priorities, right? Values drive our priorities, right? What's important to us, right, is what we value, right? So our values is what we value, right? So I know this does not sound very profound, but this is the very core of it, and it's easy to overlook, right? I mean, most people are like, oh, I don't want to go through the, values exercise. I mean, that's not really that important. Well, okay, that's great. But then when you're making the decisions, do you know what's important to you and why you're making this decision, right? So I know that all of a sudden stops people in their tracks and be like, well, I don't know why I'm making this. Okay, well then, take a moment and think what's important, right? And if you want to get aligned with another person, well, then make sure that those values are very much in alignment, right? Or at least in the same type of category, right? So for example, fulfillment and enjoyment, right? So seems to be the same thing, but dig deeper. What does that actually mean, right? Like, what does fulfillment mean and what does enjoyment mean, right? So, I mean, sound very similar, right? But in reality, I mean, enjoyment can be somebody working extremely hard on something that they're extremely passionate about, right? And fulfillment, for example, may be having a big picture view on things. Like anything can be fulfilling, right? So one is very specific, like I'm going to drive this down, right? And fulfillment may be, for somebody walking around, on the street and enjoying the surroundings, right? Or vice versa. I mean, these things can be very, very interchangeable. Actually, fulfillment could be, very much of somebody who's working extremely hard, but on something that they love, and they don't even notice that that's, taking away all this time, because that's the time that they see as valuable. But maybe somebody thinks of enjoyment as, a day on, at the beach, and then the work-life balance, which, you know what I mean? Like different things bring joy. So make sure you understand what is it that drives this value, right? So you're on the same page. Even though the value sounds very similar, different things drive it. So don't just stop at the surface level of the value, right? So understand what is the core on each. You know what I mean? Like how did this value come about? Now, of course, that's an alignment also with the, mission and vision. I mean, like, what are you on the mission to do? Like, what's your big vision? Like, what's the end result, right? What are your expectations? Like, get aligned on the expectations, because if one is expecting this and the other one expecting that, and these things are not in alignment, right? Then these two things, are probably not going to work well together. For example, with team members, right? Make sure that you understand how your expectations are on the same page, right? And if there is a disagreement, and by the way, I want to make sure there's a distinction between disagreement, right, and a misalignment. Now, misalignment is a very global type of perspective, right? It allows for an opportunity to get realigned, or rethink, how and what, together collectively, right? Disagreement is usually personal, right? It's driven by a personal standpoint and the need to prove yourself right. So I would like for you to have maybe sometimes a misalignment. I would prefer for you to have a misalignment, right? Because that's that's workable, right? Like you can get aligned if there's, a disconnect right in there. So you can most definitely work on getting this connected. But if you have a disagreement, right, and if that's the root cause of the misalignment is the disagreement and the ego is involved, right, then you got to put that ego aside and understand that there's a misalignment. And that, I mean, of course, not all misalignments work out, right? Sometimes you just misalign on the vision or misalign on the values, and that's the end. But in disagreement, when the ego is involved, that needs to be something that's separated out of the conversation, right? So your conversations should not be driven by your need to prove that you're right. So, or to prove that you're worthy, or to prove that your point of view really matters, right? And it does. Know inherently that your point of view matters, right? Know that at your core. This is where, again, that alignment with yourself is so hugely important, and sense of self is hugely important. But I feel like, the disagreement, needs to not come or not to be driven by your ego's need to prove its existence. Anyway, trust is going to be huge. Make sure that trust is there, right? And trust is developed through actions, right? Is through consistent actions, right? Trust is not a once, day thing, right? It's an evolution of actions, right? And for one, knowing how trust is evolved, right? Of course, boundaries. Know the other person's boundaries and respect them. I mean, that's huge. Understand, where it's okay, right? Like I think everybody should understand first and foremost their own boundaries, but then understand and respect the other person's boundaries. So that respect, is going to be one of the key elements in developing good relationships, right? And a good alignment. Now, communication, like whether it's styles of communication, right? I mean, you have to respect different people have different ways of communicating, but understand the cadence of communication, right? So communication has to be open, right? But also respectful, right? Open communication doesn't mean that you get an opportunity to insult whoever you want, right, at any time, right, and tell them what you think. Put the communication in a constructive way where you are relaying your point of view, respecting the other person's point of view, and opening discussion for a buy-in, right? So communication is not a one-sided element. Communication is always a two-way track, and you got to meet yourself. It's like a tango, right? You have to get in sync. So very important. I think ego I already mentioned, but I mean, I think these are like some of the key elements of that. I mean, we can certainly, make this a separate topic, for another time, but I feel like that's, these are the key things that are important in alignment.
Yes. So discussing values, see if there's any kind of like, even the words that people use might be different, see if there's any commonalities there, and then figure out like, okay, if there's disagreement, is it because of the ego or more fundamental value kind of disagreement? And then like discuss the mission and vision. It could be like people have different views on the mission and vision, but maybe through discussions, communication, you can kind of bring something together, like bring everyone's idea and make something that works for everyone. And then the trust, that takes time and like through different iterations, but hopefully that the trust can be built up over time and then be aligned in some way.
Consistent action, right? Consistent action where you come through with the promises that you've made, right? It's trust is, of course, developed also, through clear communication with respect, where you respect the other person and their boundaries and their personal needs, right? I think that's huge, right? So I'm seeing this, very often these days, is that is not there, but it's, simply because people don't know what their boundaries are. They're not good at communicating their boundaries, but also the other party is not understanding where those boundaries are. So this communication has to be, one of the key elements of that is where you come together in an open conversation, right? With respect, for the other person, right? Just the respect for another human being, right? you know, trust is developed, but respect, you can respect anybody and their opinion, and even if you don't agree, right? So respect is where ego steps aside.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. I love to emphasize on the respect part. I mean, these are like some of the key elements that like we might not always be thinking about, like because when people have goals or agenda and like people are so focused on like reaching those goals and sometimes like forget about the human side of things, including myself sometimes would do that, and kind of like it's good to always think about these important parts that we might not be thinking of sometimes.
Yep. Great. Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much,
Of
Elena.
course. Yes. Anytime. I'm very happy to participate in these conversations. I think they're very, very important. And most importantly, I think that they open minds and help you think differently, that, you know, they bring awareness to
Yeah.
how you've been doing things and what you should be doing going forward, right? You know, obviously it is your decision and your choice how you want to proceed, but hopefully, you know, the audience would be taking these as, you know, points to grow and develop, points to bring awareness, you know, to how they're being and what's important to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. I think the
Thank you.
self-awareness part is key.